Yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first installment in Sages of the Ages, our biographical sketches, series of insights, as we promoted it, Become a Student of the Wise. And we will study the lives and legacy, times and achievements, as well as in some cases, tribulations of five great personalities, mostly from the 16th century. As we shall see, Don Isaac Abarbanel died in 1508, so he lived most of his life in the 15th century, but we'll do in the coming weeks Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Moshe Isserlis, his collaborator, the great Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, and finally Maharal, the famous philosophical genius and also Kabbalist of Prague. So those are coming attractions. So our subject tonight is Don Isaac Abarbanel. The Abarbanel family was renowned, was prominent for generations. And although probably our subject tonight is the most famous personality to bear that surname, but he came already from a very distinguished family. If you look for those who have the outline, item number one, his father, Judah Abarbanel, was an advisor to the King of Portugal. His grandfather, Samuel Abarbanel, was an advisor to the King of Castile. The family was an old Castilian family for many generations stretching back, and it was actually Abarbanel's father, Judah Abarbanel, who fled in 1391 because of the massacres, or possibly even his grandfather Samuel may have fled because of the massacres in Spain in 1391, fled to Portugal. So therefore, the subject of our discussion tonight, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel lived most of his life in Portugal, although he did not stay there, as we shall see. The pronunciation of the name is subject to some dispute. It's colloquially called Abarbanel, but scholars have suggested it should really be Abravanel, which is possibly more accurate from the Spanish point of view. And the classic work on the life of Abarbanel is this book called Don Isaac Abravanel by a man called, was statesman and philosopher, by a man called Ben Zion Netanyahu. He is the late father of Bibi Netanyahu, and he was a very distinguished Jewish historian, and this is one of his famous books, this full-length biography. He wrote it first, I think, in Hebrew. It's been translated here into English about our subject, Don Isaac Abarbanel, or as I say, some have suggested it should be Abravanel. We'll call him Abarbanel, it's just the more common pronunciation. The question of the derivation is an interesting one as well. What is the origin of the name Abarbanel? Some have suggested it comes from Av Rabban El. Rabban, like the rabbi, or the Kohen, like the priest. So like the greatest of the priests of God. Av Rabban El. Probably more likely, though, it's just a diminutive of Avramel. Like you have a boy called Avram, they call him Avramel. So Abarbanel is probably just a corruption or diminutive of Avraham. We find something similar in one of the other personalities we're going to explore in the coming weeks. That is Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis. So his name was Moshe. His father was called Isser, Yisrael, so he became known as Isserlis. So really, in a similar way, Abarbanel is probably derives from a diminutive of Avraham, which may have gone back many, many generations, and as I say, the name perhaps stuck for that reason. The family origins, we mentioned already, they fled Castile for Portugal following the massacres of 1391, which in retrospect we can identify as the beginning of the end of Spanish Jewry. At the time, although it was a terribly traumatic experience, they hoped that it was sort of the worst, and the worst is over. They could not have any way of realizing that just over 100 years later, in 1492, the curtain would come down on probably 1,000 years or more of Jewish life in Iberia. So it's a slight irony here that the family fled from Castile to Portugal And as we shall see, Abarbanel himself fled from Portugal into Spain, and as a result, he was expelled and exiled from Spain in 1492. If he had stayed in Portugal, although as we'll see, he may have lost his life if he had stayed, but nevertheless, the Jews in Portugal were expelled only 5 years later in 1497. But it was a dark time, and as we shall see, Abarbanel played a very important role, albeit, and one could say, a tragic role in those events. So let's talk first about his the main part of his life numerically was in Lisbon. He grew up in Lisbon, which at that time was a strong Torah community, a strong Jewish community. His mentors were Rav Yosef Chayun and Rav Yosef Ibn Shem Tov, not nearly as well known as Abarbanel himself, but they were of Kabbalistic inclinations. And we do find that Abarbanel himself has some understanding and some familiarity with the Kabbalistic tradition, although he is certainly more distinguished as a philosopher than as a Kabbalist. His natural inclination, it seems, was more towards the rational than the mystical, albeit he was ushered into the mystical tradition through the teachings of those mentors. Yeah, do you have a handout? Yeah, you do. Okay. He, as a young man already at the age of 20, began to write, and he produced some worthy Torah works of scholarship, even beginning at the age of 20. And that was perhaps his first love, that is to say, the study of Torah and writing and exploring and productivity, creativity in the realm of Torah study and exegesis. However, perhaps unsurprisingly, he was not destined to a life of the gentleman scholar. He, having grown up in a family that was so distinguished and that had a career already going back generations of providing important services to the crown, he was summoned to the service of King Alfonso V, and he became a tax farmer and active in the treasury. So in the days of Alfonso, Abarbanel became the leader of the Jewish community, and he was very active in what became known as Shtadlanut. Shtadlanut is advocacy or activism on the part of the Jewish community. Again, from a prominent family, a Torah scholar, a wealthy, successful financier, someone who had the ear of the king, someone who provided a valuable service to the king. Of course, he was well positioned to act on behalf of the Jewish people. Despite my comments that things were good in those days, it was only a relative designation. The hostility, the antagonism towards Jews in Catholic Spain and Portugal as well was intense. And as I say, it was relatively peaceful times, but certainly the Jewish community was always in a kind of state of insecurity because of the continuous hostility of the Catholic Church and, so to speak, the man in the street. At the same time, because of his use to the crown, so he was able to provide, as I say, that valuable service. We have an example in the Portuguese army carried out a raid in Morocco, and they essentially captured and enslaved the entire Jewish community. They brought them to Portugal, and there was about 250 members, and they were all on the slave market. So Abarbanel mobilized a campaign to raise money for their redemption. He contributed a large amount of money himself. He raised other funds from the Portuguese Jewish community. He even wrote to a friend in Italy to come up with some more money, and they were able to ransom the entire Jewish community, no doubt at considerable expense. But this was one of many examples of his extreme philanthropy, and as I say, he gave from his own pocket as well as raising money from others. Unfortunately, like most things in life, especially in politics, the good times don't last. And in 1481, Alfonso died, and a war of succession began in its wake. And Abarbanel possibly backed the wrong horse, and he was accused of conspiracy by the son and the successor of Alfonso. This is John II. Is John who would later marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And as Ruthie likes to relate, one of the terms of the shidduch was that John of Portugal, would have to expel the Jews because it was anathema to Ferdinand and Isabella that their daughter should be married to someone who tolerates the Jews in his realm. So Abarbanel did not favor this John. He backed the Duke of Braganza, but the Duke of Braganza was executed, and there was a warrant for the arrest and likely execution of Don Isaac Abarbanel as well. He was warned in time, and he fled to Castile, or actually to Spain initially, and to Toledo, and then he settled in Castile. But he fled, leaving his wealth behind. It's unclear exactly. He possibly was clever enough to take some with him, took his American Express card or something. I'm sure he had something with him, but most of his property was confiscated, and as I say, he escaped with his life. So he was fortunate to have even emerged alive, but things were already going downhill in Portugal for the Jews, and certainly for Abarbanel himself. And he settled in Toledo in 1483. So Abarbanel, in a way, was returning to his roots in Spain. For those who are aware, Spain and Portugal have an ancient hostility, antagonism, rivalry. And Portuguese, although geographically Portugal occupies much of the western section of the Iberian Peninsula, but linguistically, Spanish and Portuguese are different languages. The Portuguese all speak Spanish, but they don't like to. But they have to because Spain is much bigger. The Spaniards don't have to speak Portuguese, and they don't know Portuguese. So there's a kind of like a rivalry there, and but for the Jews, certainly for Abarbanel, who derived from an old Castilian family, the return to Castile, although under unhappy circumstances, was an adjustment that he was able to take in his stride. And in Spain, he returned to his first love. His first love was Torah. And as a refugee, he took up writing again. And he was a man of extraordinary gifts and productivity. I have here the one volume of his commentary on the Torah. This is Bereshit. I think it consists of about 440 pages, full pages of text. This is just Bereshit. There are 5 books of the Torah, let me remind you. So, he wrote extensively. We'll look a little bit more closely into his style in a short while. But he took up, before he turned to the Torah, to the Chumash, he took up another subject which was relatively neglected and remains relatively neglected, and that is the Nevi'im Rishonim in particular. The Nevi'im Achronim, the later prophets, like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, these are a bit more poetic and a bit more, you could say, dramatic, a bit more sort of profound or exciting from a theological standpoint. But the Nevi'im Rishonim, the earlier books of the prophets, that's the book of Yehoshua, Shoftim, Judges, Shmuel, Malachim, these are more historical, and they were not as popular, and therefore he undertook to write extensive commentaries on these books. He also wrote very extensive introductions to them, putting the book and the events in historical context. What's fascinating is he knew more about matters of state than most rabbis, for reasons that we have already described. And therefore he related the events in those books to contemporary political developments as well. And he brought a politician's expertise and sophistication to his subject. So whereas he was a rabbinic scholar for certain, but he also had that breadth. And when we talk a little bit more about his style and his writings, we'll return to that theme further. But what is fascinating is that in his early time in Castile, he was extremely productive in his Torah scholarship. If you take a look, I've got in Roman numeral 3 where it says Spain, and under A as a refugee, his commentary on Yehoshua, he completed it in 16 days. He wrote the commentary, not studied it in 16 days. He wrote it in 16 days, commentary on Yehoshua. His commentary on Judges, Shoftim, he began on the 1st of Kislev, and he finished it on the first day of Hanukkah. When is Hanukkah? 25th of Kislev. So within 25 days, he wrote the entire commentary on this book. How extensive? It's quite extensive. I don't have it because I'm guilty of the same thing that Abarbanel was criticizing. I don't study Nevi'im Rishonim that much, so maybe I should have, but I don't. But I have consulted it because when I did my master's thesis, I did consult Abarbanel quite a lot, but I used a library copy, not my own. His magnum opus, though, in that area in terms of Nevi'im, is his commentary on Shmuel. Sefer Shmuel is a long, fascinating, extensive sefer. He wrote a magisterial introduction to the book of Shmuel. He completed this entire book, which is a voluminous accomplishment, in 10 weeks. His entire commentary on the Sefer Shmuel he completed in 10 weeks. So he had a gift, and he just was able to produce these original and thorough commentaries as well. Okay, we'll talk a bit more about his style in due course. But again, it was not to last. He was summoned to the service of Ferdinand and Isabella, who now reigned over the United Kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. And in terms of the history of Spain, this was a very important development. We think of Spain today, to the extent that we do think about it, a bit of sunshine and a bit of matadors and that sort of thing. We think of Spain as a country which has, Atlantic coast, Mediterranean coast, etc. We think of it as a single country. But historically, Spain was divided into a number of different kingdoms. And it was rare, looking at the sweep of Spanish history, that it was united under a single kingdom. Even to this day, as you probably know, in Catalan, they're still agitating for independence. A few years ago, they even had a referendum, and Madrid did not appreciate it very much. Ruthie and I were in Barcelona a few months ago, and we saw still vestiges of that, and there still is a kind of undercurrent of agitation for independence. So when Ferdinand and Isabella married, this was a very significant event. Actually, the classic work on the history of Jews in Christian Spain is called exactly that, History of the Jews in Christian Spain, by Yitzchak Ber. It was originally written in Hebrew, actually, although he was German. It's translated into English. He's called Fritz Ber. And as you can see, it's two full-length volumes with copious footnotes as well. And when I was in graduate school, we had a lot of reading assignments from this book, these 2 volumes. Although it was published more than 50 years ago, it still remains the classic work on our subject, History of the Jews in Christian Spain. There's another one written by a different author, The History of the Jews in Muslim Spain, which is a different era, etc. Although, as we shall see, the 2 subjects merge very shortly. We'll see the significance of that. So when Ferdinand and Isabella married, so the United Kingdoms came about, and in order to administer such a vast territory and diverse territory, they called on Don Isaac Abarbanel to be their finance minister. And he became a very important member of the inner circle of the court. And again, his success, his finesse, his talent, his statesmanship, his connections, and his wealth were all deployed in the service of the crown, but no doubt he benefited from that as well, as is natural. And with his money, he was able to accomplish sometimes useful things for the Jewish people. Unfortunately, the wheels of time had turned against the Jews at this point. Ferdinand and Isabella, especially Isabella, were fanatic Catholics, and they were egged on by the most fanatic person of them all, Torquemada. I will talk about him in a moment. But before we get to the bitter climax of it all, take a look at source number 3, letter B. Number 1, he financed the invasion of the Muslim kingdom of Granada. Now, Spain is divided into different regions. The southern part of Spain is called Andalusia. You've probably been there, Costa del Sol and all of that. Malaga, Granada, Cordoba, Marbella, all of these areas. So that was the last holdout of the Muslim presence in Iberia. Just a bit of very broad brush history to understand the significance of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The Jews were in Spain from at least the 2nd century of the Common Era. There is evidence they were there even before. According to tradition, the Jews were in Spain even long before that, even in the days of the First Temple, the days of the Second Temple, possibly even the days of the First Temple of Bais Rishon. The Jews had lived in Spain long before Christianity. Well, according to this tradition, they were in Spain.
In the book of Ovadia.
Yes, so there's a pasuk in Ovadia, Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad, the exile of Jerusalem that is in Spain. And that pasuk was often cited by the Jews of Spain to demonstrate their antiquity. Why were they so keen to demonstrate or to emphasize that they are veteran settlers? So the obvious reason is they wanted to say, we've been here for so long, don't even think about expelling us. We've been here, from antiquity. But there's something further than that as well. What's the significance that the young lady has mentioned of the fact that it appears in the book of Ovadia, which describes the exile of Jerusalem, which is in Spain, in the book of Ovadia? What is the significance? What is the difference if the Jews were in Spain, let's say from 500 years before the Common Era, or if they only arrived a couple of centuries after the Common Era? There's a big difference potentially. Certainly in the polemics, there's a big difference. Christianity, and therefore what?
Whether they were there before. The Christians or after.
Okay.
So they didn't kill Jesus.
Very good. That's the point. You see, the Jews were condemned as, I don't want to say they are next to their Kodesh, but for the purpose of clarity and history, as Christ killers. They were, and in some quarters even to this day. But in the Middle Ages, that was, on the lips, standard fare. So the Spanish Jews said, well, we don't know who killed Jesus, but it definitely wasn't us because we have been here before then. We've been here since the time of Bais Rishon, since hundreds of years before the Common Era. So maybe it was the Romans, maybe it was the Jews, but it wasn't us. It wasn't our, ancestors, because we've been in Spain all of this time. Also, they had the vision of themselves as the elite of world Jewry as well. The Sephardim, don't have any Sephardim here tonight, perhaps not, but anyway, the Sephardim have always imagined themselves to be the elite of world Jewry, and this fit into their self-image because Galut Yerushalayim, it was for the tribe of Yehuda who was in Yerushalayim, so they're the elite. So the Jews were in Spain for many, many hundreds of years. Under the Visigoths, they were persecuted. When the Muslims invaded Spain. Does anybody know when that was? It's easy to remember the year. The year is 711. It's also a good place to get a Slurpee late at night if you want. 711. In the year 711, Jabal Abu Tariq. That's right. He led a Muslim army across the Straits of Gibraltar from Morocco, from the Maghreb into Iberia, and he conquered the Muslims conquered most of Spain at that time, most of the Spanish of the Iberian Peninsula. That's why Gibraltar is known by that name. It's a corruption of Jabal Abu Tariq, Gibraltar, because he was the general in the Muslim army. How is this relevant to Abarbanel? It happened a long time before Abarbanel lived. The answer is that under the Muslims, life for the Jews was greatly improved. Generally speaking, the life for the Jews in Iberia under Muslim rule was much better than it had been under the Catholics. That lasted until about the year 1150, approximately. after which, again, things turned against the Jews. I don't need to discuss that at length. It's not our subject now. For those who were here last series, we spoke about Rambam and Maimonides and his family, and they fled as a result of the Almohades who invaded Spain again in 1049. In 1149. The point is that the Islamic sort of fundamentalism became the order of the day, but equally, simultaneously, over a course of many centuries, the reconquest had already begun. The fight back in which the Christians, over the generations and the centuries, they retook Spain in waves. So that if the Muslims began in the south and spread throughout the rest of Iberia, so when the Christians fought back, so the Muslims were pushed back and back and back. And that's why even to this day, the Islamic, the Arab and Islamic influence on Spain is strongest in the south. That's where you have a lot of words and a lot of places and the architecture still reflects the Islamic influence. Because whereas, as I said, they arrived in 711, but they were kicked out over time, but they endured the longest in the very southern section. And that takes us to the Alhambra Decree. Because after 800 years of fight back in 1492, the Christians, Ferdinand and Isabella, with their united kingdom and their united army, finally booted out the last of the Muslims. And with that, they realized, now that we've been fighting Muslims for 800 years, we finally booted them out, why are we tolerating all of these Jews? And this is the bitter irony, because Don Isaac Abarbanel, he lent the crown money to finance the war. How much does it cost to finance a war? A whole lot. I think America spent about $1 trillion in the Iraq War and its aftermath. So I tried to do a bit of research. How much was the money worth? Because he lent the crown 1.2 million real at that time. 1.2 million. I can't quite work it out, but do you think there's been a lot of inflation since the 15th century? I'm sure there has been. It is said that at least approximately 10% of that amount came from his own pocket. But he didn't do it out of the kindness of his heart. I mean, I'm sure it was at interest, I'm sure he... So, but they wanted the loan, they needed the loan. So he arranged the loan. He chipped in 10% of it from his own resources. He raised the rest of the money from other investors, etc., etc. And he financed the war against the Muslims. And they finally defeated them and they turfed them out. And then Ferdinand and Isabella said to Abarbanel, okay, now we're going to take care of your lot as well. And this was at the urging of Torquemada. And on the 31st of March in 1492, the Alhambra Decree was written, and this was a decree of expelling the Jews from all of Spain. And it seems that they gave them 4 months to get their affairs together and to leave. They had lived in Spain, as we said, for maybe 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years, maybe almost as much as 2,000 years. And they had deep roots in Spain. They had, in many cases, quite a lot of influence, quite a lot of wealth. And it was either kiss the cross or kiss your home, your money, and everything else goodbye. They were allowed to take with them only very limited amounts and no silver or gold.
20 days.
Well, they had 4 months from the time that the edict was signed. However, the news, of course, didn't travel instantly. But besides that, many people, foremost among them, Isaac Abarbanel, tried mightily to get the regents to reconsider and to cancel the decree. This decree was issued at the urging of Torquemada, who was the Inquisitor General and the confessor to the monarchs. The Inquisition had been established in 1483, some years before, but Torquemada insisted it wasn't enough just to persecute backsliding Christians, including Jews who had, outwardly accepted Christianity but were suspected of Jewish behavior or Jewish convictions, but rather it was necessary to completely expel the Jews in their entirety. Now, it's likely that Ferdinand and Isabella religious zealots though they were, probably were reluctant to expel all the Jews, because the Jews were useful, the Jews were productive, the Jews were well integrated, the Jews were frequently well educated. They played an important role in the society and in the commerce. And by the way, when the Jews were expelled, it began a decline from which Spain never recovered. In fact, when Ruthie and I visited the Jewish Museum in Istanbul some years ago, we saw a quotation from the Sultan at the time, his name escapes me at the moment, and he said, "They say that Ferdinand and Isabella are wise, but I say they are fools, because they have impoverished their country and enriched mine." Because many of the Jewish exiles made their way to the Ottoman Empire, to Turkey and to the Ottoman Empire, which rose to prominence partly because of the influx of all of those Jews. The first book printed in Asia, I think I mentioned it last session for those who were here, was the writing of the Torah, the commentary of the Torah, which was the pre-runner to the Shulchan Aruch. That was the first book printed in all of Asia, because they didn't have a printing press. They didn't know that people couldn't read, and people didn't have the technology. It was the Jews who came from Spain who brought with them the technology to print. And the first book ever printed in Asia was, maybe China, they said they had printing press even earlier, but certainly in the Ottoman Empire, the first book ever printed was a Hebrew book. So, and that's besides all of those who went to Amsterdam and all who went to Italy and all of those who went a few generations later who came to London as well. It's all part of the same phenomenon of accomplished, well-connected, able, educated, resourceful Jews who were expelled from Spain, who did great things for all of Spain's competitors. So it's likely that Ferdinand and Isabella were conscious of that, and they probably were reluctant to expel the Jews, even though, of course, they plundered their property, because it was like a fire sale, you know. If they have to leave, then their homes and their businesses are not going to fetch much money, because they've got to leave anyway. So why should a person say, I'll put up an offer for a home, a Jewish home, if I wait a few weeks, I can take it for free, so why should I pay for it?
Why would they be more reluctant than Hitler? Actually, he wasn't reluctant, and they were the high echelons of his society.
That's a good question. His
fanaticism just and Jew hatred, and we don't consider.
Yeah, I think you're raising a valid point. Jew hatred frequently is irrational and frequently is self defeating. But actually, it's an open question about Hitler. Some say that Hitler's war against the Jews actually undermined his own war effort. As you say, like he by persecuting the Jews, expelling the Jews, and seeking to murder the Jews, he actually diverted his own attention from the war effort. But others have said that it was more cunning than that, that he harnessed the hatred of Jews that was latent within the German society. And of course, he plundered their property mercilessly, so that maybe he actually profited by it. But I take your point. We could probably give a few other examples of people who, in their obsessive hatred of Jews, actually undermine their own best interests. It's probably true. Yeah, say.
Recent research among the universities in Madrid, they had an article that the reason they expelled the Jews is because they were afraid of the crypto Jews who had the inclination to go back to Judaism.
Yes.
And Torquemada was a crypto Jew.
Well, he himself?
He himself.
Really? That's
what
interesting.
they're saying.
That's an interesting theory.
This is why they decided to uproot.
And so that it's interesting theory that he himself was of, as you say, crypto-Jewish origins. I think it's a bold thesis, but it certainly is true that they were concerned that many Jews had already converted to Christianity outwardly, but probably very few of them were sincere converts. And as you say, there was a concern that the thriving, or at least the functioning Jewish community would serve as a lure for those new Christians to come back to Judaism. So by expelling all the Jews, all the practicing Jews, they felt at least in this way they'll be able to keep those Jews who have converted. Yeah, that certainly was part of his thing. In any case, I just want to tell you the legend. It's difficult to know if it's really true. That definitely it is true that Abarbanel offered a very extensive payment. You could call it a bribe to cancel the decree. I saw a few different figures mentioned. Some say 300,000 ducats of silver, which I'm sure would have been a vast amount of money. I mean, if you say that the whole war effort cost 1.2 million for the whole war effort, then, or at least that was the extent of the loan, 300,000 ducats would have been a very substantial amount of money. And they were very much wavering. They were very much inclined to say, maybe we should cancel this, take the cash and carry on. They said, the legend is that Torquemada rushed into the chamber and he threw down a crucifix and he said, will you repeat the sin of Judas and sell our Lord for money? And so they were convinced to carry out with it, and these efforts to rescind the decree proved to be in vain. But there is a footnote to the story, more than a footnote really, which I want to read. It's a footnote in the context of our study of Don Isaac Abarbanel, but it's a fascinating component of the story itself. If you take a look, I've done this in a kind of sophisticated way. It's Roman numeral 3, where it says Spain, under B, 2.3, and then 2.31. The tragedy of the court rabbi of Castile, Don Abraham Signor of Segovia. Now, this Abraham Signor was the chief rabbi, or the court rabbi, which means that he was more of a political appointee than perhaps a scholar or a saint, as we shall see. He, like Abarbanel, was very prominent in the court, very prominent in the politics, and in fact, he was the shadchan to Ferdinand and Isabella. He was the one, he was the power broker who got them together. Whether they, had any love between them, I'm not going to go down that path at all anyway. I mean, what can you expect from Catholic, royals? But it, of course, was a marriage for political alliance, and he was the shadchan, and he was the power broker, and he was a friend and colleague of Abarbanel. And he also endeavored to get them to rescind the decree. But whereas Abarbanel was not prepared to consider himself staying in Spain when all the Jews were expelled, this Abraham Signor not only considered it, but he actually converted to Christianity. He actually was baptized together with his family on the 15th of June, 1492. When he had to choose between going into exile, leaving behind his prestige and his influence and his wealth and all of the, trappings of glory and all of that, he was not up to the nisayon, to the test, and he submitted to baptism. They say, and I'm sure this is apocryphal, that having debated the matter extensively and finally going to the baptismal font together with his family on the 15th of June, there was still enough time afterwards in the Spanish summertime to daven mincha before sunset still. Which is a humorous way of saying that his conversion was completely insincere, and that as far as he was concerned, there's still time for mincha. He'll get together a minyan for mincha still the same day. I'm saying tongue in cheek, but it was a way that people had kind of expressed the patent insincerity of these conversions. What about Abarbanel himself? So they offered Abarbanel a special dispensation. They offered him court protection, that he and his family can stay in Spain without converting. They can remain practicing Jews, just don't leave. And Abarbanel, of course, refused that offer, and he left on the 31st of July, 1492, together with hundreds of thousands of Jewish emigres. Difficult to know how many. Some say up to 300,000. Probably was not quite that many.
How much was the global population
the global Jewish population, the global Jewish population in Spain in its entirety. Well, that's just what I'm saying. Difficult to estimate. I would say, because this is a figure that I think is more reliable, there were about 250,000 Jews in Spain, of whom roughly half stayed and half went into exile. Excuse me?
And converted?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. That's why today it's estimated that maybe 20% of Spaniards today have Jewish blood. And not only that, but in South America as well. They say that many of them, and I come across them for certain reasons, who claim Jewish antecedents and Jewish blood. You said about Torquemada, the Spanish dictator Franco was said to be of Anusim, of crypto-Jewish origins as well. Excuse me? Christopher Columbus possibly as well. Possibly. There is reason to think Columbus may have also been one of these crypto-Jews. So
also Lorca, the famous poet.
Also?
That was assassinated by Franco in 1936. His family
also from
lived in Lorca, where there was a Jewish concentration there.
Interesting. Ruthie and I took a group a few years ago to Portugal. We visited a little town in the Portuguese mountains called Belmonte. It's a very deprived area. It's one of the most poorest, impoverished areas in all of Western Europe. And there's a small village there called Belmonte, and there is, to this very day, a functioning, one could even say thriving, crypto-Jewish community. Jews who have come, emerged from the shadow of the church and have now come out into the light. So it's most remarkable how many of these Jewish families over the centuries literally have retained that sort of tradition of Jewish ancestry. In any case, I saw this figure 300,000 who went into exile. It's probably an exaggeration. I would say it's more like 250,000 altogether, of whom maybe half stayed and converted. Now, some of those had already converted, because after 1391, remember we mentioned a whole series of bloody pogroms. Many Jews already at that time converted to Christianity. But most of them were not sincere, which is why the Inquisition began to focus upon them. Okay, I want to be sure we finish in time, so let's just go on. So I put in parentheses 2 August 1492, it was the fast of 9th of Av. Now, one of the discoveries I made when I was in graduate school was that the very well-known tradition that the expulsion from Spain took place on Tisha B'Av is a bit doubtful. It's according to the historical evidence, it took place 2 days before that. So for historical purposes, we kind of merge it together and say, well, it's close enough. And I think it is close enough. It's certainly within the, Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av. And even if it's not the exact same day, it definitely is close enough to encapsulate and to be consistent with the theme. But be that as it may, we like to associate. It could be they didn't all leave on exactly the same day. I mean, imagine, lo aleinu, thousands and thousands of people, Jews, who go to a port and they need to get on the next boat. Well, how many boats are there? I mean, it wasn't like, they can just send a few more ferries over from Gibraltar to take them. So it's very possible that the deadline may have been then, but there may have been many who left also on Tisha B'Av. It probably took a few days and of course you can imagine the exploitation on the part of the captains. There were cases of some captains who set out to sea, maybe 6, 10, 12 miles, and then they just threw all the Jews into the ocean and went back for more. There are many cases of that as well, because they knew that this is a bonanza, the Jews need to go, they'll pay top ducat or whatever the currency was. So the exploitation was merciless. Of course, many of the Jews did not go by boat. They went just by foot to Portugal. The largest number probably just hit the road. They went west to Portugal. The wealthier ones tended to go to Italy and even to Amsterdam. The poor ones went to Morocco. Some of them eventually made their way, as we said, to the Ottoman Empire. The most devout made their way to of course, the land of Israel. And we'll speak about that actually next week, because Rav Yosef Karo was among those families who eventually did go to the Ottoman Empire and subsequently to Eretz Israel. So Abarbanel left with the exiles holding a Sefer Torah, with his head held high and with his wealth, vast wealth, plundered by the crown. Again, he was probably clever enough to take a few gold coins with him, even though that was illegal, but probably he was able to smuggle some out. He went to Naples, and in Naples, he picked up his pen and he finished the commentary on the Book of Kings that he started 8 years before. He didn't lose any time. He didn't, just become completely depressed and traumatized by it. And you see the strength of the man, the greatness, the way in which he was able to find, I won't say the blessing, but find some consolation within the tragedy by turning to his writing. And he finished the book of his commentary on Sefer Malachim. Unfortunately, Naples was within a few years conquered by the French, and his wealth was again plundered. And he went into exile once more. He went to Sicily, to Messina, to Corfu in the Greek Isles, and ultimately to Monopoli in southern Italy, not the board game from Atlantic City. But the last years of his life were spent in Venice. He made his way to Venice in 1503. And he took up finance once again. He negotiated an important deal of spices. You know, the spice trade was very lucrative trade, very important trade between the Venetian kingdom and his old friends in Portugal, or his old, well, I suppose when it comes to money, you make friends once again. So they may have run him out of town a few decades before, but when it came to an opportunity for a business deal, so he negotiated this spice trade agreement in Venice in 1503. He died in 1508 in Venice, and he was buried in Padua. I think that the Jewish cemetery in Padua, the Jewish community in Padua, was maybe more advanced. It may also have been a very practical matter. Everyone knows that Venice is built on water, so it could be that to bury in Venice and around Venice is not, the graves don't last long because of the water table, etc. I'm only speculating. In any case, he was buried in Padua, in the cemetery in Padua in 1508, next to Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, one of the great halachic authorities of the generation. But tragically, the cemetery was overrun the following year, and we don't know where his burial place is any longer. We can only say in a general way where the Jewish cemetery was in the 16th century in Padua, but we have no grave, no marker, and nothing tragically for Don Isaac Abarbanel. In the minutes we have left, I'd like to talk a little bit about his writings, which were very extensive. His style is comprehensive. When he takes up a subject, he looks at it from every point of view. He cites many previous authorities, commentators as well, and but therefore it is prolix. Prolix is a fancy way of saying very wordy. He writes at considerable length, and he has a certain style in which he takes up a subject, like a chapter of the Chumash or a parsha. It's normally not an entire sedra, but a certain passage, and he begins with asking a few questions. Sometimes he asks as many as 40 questions, and then he sets about answering the questions. They used to say that Abarbanel's style is very unsafe, because when does a Yid have time to learn Chumash? After he eats the cholent on Shabbos afternoon. So he's, working all time, the whole week he's working very hard, and now Shabbos he's going to learn. So what does he do? He cracks open Abarbanel, and he sits in the chair, and he's, after a full meal and a l'chaim or two, and he starts to read all the questions. Well, it doesn't take long before he dozes off. He never gets to the answers, and he wakes up and says, these are devastating questions, What's the Torah talking about over here? It doesn't make any sense at all. So you can become an apikoros, because all he knows, he just reads the question, he doesn't even get to the answers. So there may be a risk factor to that. It's interesting, he may have refined his style, because later on, when he started his other commentaries, he restricts himself arbitrarily to 6 questions. Maybe he realized so many questions, that the reader gets boggled, with all the questions. So his new style was only 6 questions at a time, and then he answers the questions. But he often defends the Rambam against the criticisms of Ramban. Again, for those who were here with us last term, we spoke about Ramban, who was a great admirer of Maimonides. Nachmanides was a great admirer of Maimonides, but he was a great critic of Maimonides at the same time, and they're not contradictory to one another. He criticized the Rambam harshly. He did not agree with the Rambam's philosophical orientation, and there are many passages in his commentary where he's very critical of the Rambam. Abarbanel is one of those who seeks to defend the Rambam against the critiques of Ramban. It's one of the things he often does in his commentary. But he doesn't always do it with all that much conviction. In one place he says, that this is the intention of, I've just got to read it because I don't know whether it's absolutely genuine or just attributed to him. He says, Ze kavanat Rabbeinu Moshe, lo kavanat Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the intention of our teacher Moshe, meaning Maimonides, not the intention of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses himself. So sometimes he defends the Rambam against the animadversions of Ramban, but one feels in Abarbanel's heart, he doesn't really feel that his defense is all that convincing. He feels maybe more sympathy for the criticism than he feels for his own attempt to defend Maimonides. And actually, as I say, Abarbanel's style and his inclination is quite inclined towards the style of Ramban in terms of spirituality, and not so much to the rigid rationalism of Maimonides of the Rambam. Let's talk briefly about his categories. So all of the sources that I have read say that the writings of Abarbanel can be summarized as three categories. Here's his biblical commentaries. And what's interesting, I put in parentheses, he refers to, which is very unusual, and sometimes even endorses Christian exegetes. Very uncommon to find a Torah commentator who, when surveying the literature and the different approaches to a certain subject, also will record the approach of Christian exegetes. Hertz does, yeah, for which he's roundly criticized. Yeah, Hertz does, that's right. Very true. But in terms of the classic commentaries, it's quite uncommon. And the interesting thing is, although Abarbanel frequently, rejects them, but occasionally he will even endorse them, and sometimes will say that the Christians have a better approach than the ones that I have found in the Jewish commentaries. The other category is philosophy. And as I've written here, at times he defends Rambam but disagrees with the excessive rationalism and especially the allegorization of the Torah. So, for example, we read just recently about the Garden of Eden. So Rambam takes that account in an allegorical way. And Abarbanel criticizes the Rambam for that. Abarbanel's most important philosophical work is called Rosh Amanah, in which he takes up the subject of the Ikarim. He defends the Rambam against the criticisms of some other authorities regarding the 13 principles of faith, but then he actually says, I don't really approve of the whole enterprise of principles of faith. He said, because the word Torah means instruction. The essence of the Torah is 613 mitzvot. He says the Torah gives us 613 commandments. The Torah doesn't list for us philosophical principles. Of course, some of the Taryag mitzvot are mitzvot in their own right, like belief in God. But other of the principles of faith of the Rambam, he says, are actually not even mitzvot in the Torah. So he says we have 613 of them, and let's work with that rather than hypothesize about philosophical underpinnings. So he was a philosopher, but he recognized the limitations of philosophy. possibly, and I don't want to be the armchair psychoanalyst, but possibly Abarbanel's own life and his experiences and his sort of philosophical perspective made him feel as if ultimately it's the teachings of the Torah which are more enduring than the attempts at deriving philosophical principles or somehow linking the Torah to philosophical principles. By the way, there was a very prominent trend among the emigres, among the Spanish exiles, to reject philosophy, and that is part of what promoted the popularity. What's the sort of alternative to philosophy? The kind of, you could say, I don't want to say the opposite, but the mirror image of philosophy. Kabbalah. Kabbalah is the rival of philosophy, and frequently those who endorse one reject the other. And that's what I'm saying. The Spanish exiles felt as if their dabbling in philosophy was the reason for their downfall, was the reason that they were expelled. It was like divine retribution for their entertaining so many philosophical ideas which originate in Christian or Islamic or Greek sources. So we find that the Spanish exiles, to a very great extent, turned their back on philosophy and were much more inclined towards towards Kabbalah instead. Yeah.
Do you think the Muslims encourage the Karaim?
Do the Muslims encourage the Karaim? It could be. It could be. I mean, you know, the expression "people of the book" actually was coined by the Muslims. That they call us the people of the book, which is a designation that that's true. They call them peoples of the book, yeah. But the point is that the book tends to elevate the study of the written Torah to the detriment of the oral Torah. So it's probably so that the Karaism flourished, especially under Islamic influence, which we do find that. Yeah.
To dilute
The Torah Shabbal Peh. Yeah, could very well be. Could very well be. Our time is pretty much up, so let's just mention the last category, which is in a way the very most interesting, which is Messiah. He wrote a lot about Mashiach. He wrote several books on the subject, which were collectively called Migdal Yeshuos, the Tower of Salvation, Mashmiya Yeshua, Yeshuas Mashiach, and he wrote a lot about belief in Mashiach as a way of buoying the spirits of the traumatized Jews of Spain whose world had come crashing down around them. Even though Jews were expelled from a lot of countries at different times, including Britain in 1290 and many other places as well, but the expulsion from Spain was the most traumatic of any expulsion. As I said, the Jews had been there for a long time. They're well integrated. They were educated. They were in many cases very affluent, very influential, and they were completely traumatized by the exile, and they thought, you know, is all hope lost? Moreover, some of them felt that this trauma must surely be the footfalls of the Messiah. It must represent a kind of fulfillment of the war of Gog and Magog. So there was a lot of messianic despair, but also messianic hope that was aroused. And that's why Abarbanel returned to that subject, and he wrote extensively about it. It's one of the most interesting and fruitful areas of his writing. Just to say that he also, one of the books here, he also wrote an extensive commentary on Moreh Nevuchim. I brought this Moreh Nevuchim here. You can see among the commentaries here, very extensive, is Abarbanel, and you can see it's, you know, small print, and this is the top is Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, and here you have the commentary of Abarbanel as well as other commentaries as well. Here you've got, look at these pages. I mean, the Rambam here, Moreh Nevuchim, is like 6 or 8 large print, and all of this is Abarbanel. You can see once he gets started, he doesn't stop that easily. He's got a lot to say. So this is, he wrote, extensive commentary on Moreh Nevuchim. This is a book, was my friend for the year a few years ago. My good friend Yaakov Levine has also been studying Abarbanel, and this is my friend for the year. I told you that this is 440 pages on Bereshit alone. So altogether it's, let's say, 2,000 pages. So this is excerpts. And this is altogether 230 pages. Instead of 2,000, 200. And you can see the pages are not that long. And I studied this very fruitfully some years ago. I can pass that around as well. And this is just short excerpts, short selections of Abarbanel's writings. And one last book that I have here is Haggadah Shel Pesach, one of the most popular Haggadot in classic times, was called Zebach Pesach, a commentary of Abarbanel on Haggadah Shel Pesach. And it was so popular that they published like a condensed version as well. And I was looking for this on the shelf, and I said, I didn't even know I had this. And I looked at it, and it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to Sadia, my son Sadia. But hopefully he doesn't mind that I've taken it tonight to show everyone. So this, I'll just press that as well. It's a modern edition, just printed a few years ago, of this classic work of Abarbanel. I'll just end by saying that towards the end of his life, he expressed regret that he had spent too much time in the service of mortal kings and not enough time serving the King of Kings. And so this is, I would say, the coda of Abarbanel, and his legacy is that of a scholar, of a hero, a tragic hero in a way, but someone who ultimately put his faith in God and his devotion to God and his leadership of the Jewish people above personal gain, personal profit, personal prestige, and all of that. At every opportunity, every time things turned against him, he picked up his pen and wrote another commentary on the Torah. So at the end of his life, he was able to look back at a lot of trauma, but a lot of achievement. And as I say, his legacy still lives on to this day. The fact that you've come out tonight on a dark and unpromising night here in the Golders Green to hear about him is also a tribute to Don Isaac Abarbanel, Zichrono Livracha. Thank you very much.
Sorry.